I wasn't going to order 1,000.
Oh, right, okay. Sorry. Put the microphone on. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. As I was saying, Hans needs no introduction. He's going to give us a talk on, I've got to get the title correctly, Proliferation of Non-Amateur CubeSats. He's then going to run on into a general IARU discussion forum. Hans, for those who don't know, is the global IARU satellite frequency coordinator. Is that the right words? And I don't envy his job at all. Over to you, Hans. Thanks.
Right, thank you very much. And to me it was quite nostalgic when I heard about the balloon flight, because I think a lot of you wouldn't remember. But many years ago, one of the first presentations which I ever gave at an AMSAT colloquium, I had lots of hair. Martin Sweeting was still wet behind the ears. And we talked about BACR, balloon carrying amateur radio. And we had a number of those projects in South Africa at the time, very successful. But obviously, those days there were no miniaturized components. There was no video yet. Any of those things hadn't been invented or developed. And there was a lot of interest here. And then Ron Broadbent said, listen, you will never, ever, have you got a problem?
Yeah, carry on.
Okay, you will never, ever be able to do a balloon launch in the UK because the government will definitely not allow it. Well, I see there's been quite a few since. And of course, they've become more sophisticated. And I see a lot of balloon launches all over the world happening right now.
Keep going.
Okay. Well, I need my slides now. That was just to say. And well done to the Electronic and Amateur Radio Club here in Surrey. I think you did a great project, because what you did is also extend it to the community and do those sort of things. Are we there?
No.
Well, we were on the screen, but...
Just use and define the external display.
Keep going.
Now, you see, that's all about technology. It always works every time. It never fails. It never gives hassles. Maybe you must rather use the $200 satellite, because that seems to work better. But it's always these kind of things. And I was worried about that.
Still going through the testing phase.
Yep. Does it work? No. It gets smaller and smaller on the screen.
HDMI. Interesting. HDMI too.
Yeah.
Wait for it. Okay. Good. Done.
Yeah, now you've got it, but I haven't got it.
You look on the screen.
That's very rude to talk like that. I'm supposed to talk to you guys. Okay, amateur radio. Don't know what happened, but that's not the slide that was supposed to start with. Okay, right. I'm going to talk about proliferation of non-amateur CubeSats and the impact that it has on amateur radio. If you just think about amateur radio and CubeSats, CubeSat projects at universities promote amateur radio. That was a general kind of message that we were giving the amateur radio community. And maybe it was true when the first few CubeSats were developed. But then, that's not generally been shown in practice. And I'm going to show you why. And it is a very worrying idea that we have now. Many of these projects are based on commercially acquired CubeSats with often no amateur radio involvement at all. They buy the CubeSat, they develop their science project, but nobody actually involved in the project has any idea about satellites, has any idea about RF, about radio technology at all. And that's really a problem, because they come to us and they say, please coordinate the frequency. We say, well, you have to be able to turn that satellite off if there's a problem. How? But don't ask me. I'm not developing the satellite. Amateur radio frequencies are the easy way out. And if you want a quick telemetry feedback, then ask radio amateurs. So there's a lot of interest, obviously, in university and other scientific organizations to use amateur frequencies because, A, you not only have an easy way of getting your frequencies, but you also have a huge community that will be only too keen to receive the signal as a challenge and feed you with the telemetry. So what do you want? I mean, it's the ideal world that we have created. But there are too many satellites and too few frequencies today. Amateur radio bands are being overcrowded by non-amateur satellites. I mean, QB50, CubeSats, orbiting PCB, you name them, there's a whole lot of new $50 satellite, $200 satellite. Are you going to change the name? All right, $50 satellite, I'll stick with that. I like the concept, by the way. Some include projects that may have application in amateur radio, and that's nice. And we always try to encourage that. To try and say, well, if you want us to coordinate, you want to use our frequencies, then make something that's of interest to the radio amateurs as well. Try and include something. Or maybe, what often happens is they launch this CubeSat. And if it's successful, many of them, of course, never actually make it. I won't tell you what I normally say when that happens. But many of them never make it. But those that do make it, after about a month or 2 months, you find the university people have lost interest. Now, if they could then turn that over into an amateur radio project, it would be far more of interest because at least you wouldn't be occupying those frequencies and just keep on sending the same telemetry over and over, which nobody's actually looking at and fulfilling no purpose. But that seldom happens. Many payloads are just of no interest to amateur radio. I mean, if we look at some of the payloads, and I know, the panel that coordinates frequencies, and we have people from the US, we have people from the UK, Germany, and I'll tell you a little bit about them later. And then we also have a guy in Japan. And the question we get asked every time when we get this request, say, but this is not amateur radio. Why aren't they in another band? CubeSats have been developed as a low-cost entry into space for experimentation, putting further pressure, particularly on our 2-meter segment. The combination of low-cost amateur and commercial radios, along with 3 IARU frequency coordination, have made this band very attractive to university and even commercial experimenters. There are now some requests we get for frequencies which are purely commercial. The guy wants to develop something, they want to prove it works, and then they want to sell it. The only problem is when they want to sell it, of course, now we get more people wanting to use amateur frequencies because that's basically the package they're trying to sell. Because most regulators actually don't understand and they don't really want to allocate frequencies or supply frequencies. So what they do is they say, use ham radio. They've got lots of spectrum. So if we look at IARU, we have a band plan. The coordinated band plans in all 3 regions with small variations. There are some variations between region 1, 2, and 3. And I think the most developed band plan is still in this region, region 1. And I think region 2 is following quite nicely. And so is region 3 actually also coming into the way, region 1 has been actually spearheading this band plan for many years. And the whole idea is that of course, it has to maximize usage and minimize interference between various types of operation. Now, there's an interesting discussion that took place in the US because the FCC in the US all of a sudden realized, but hang on, it's actually quite illegal in terms of ITU regulations to use amateur frequencies or amateur licensing. So what they said is, okay, we will issue, or you can apply for an experimental's license. Now, an experimental license has one problem, and that is it's not allowed to be communicating out of your area. So if you have an experimental license in the US, you may not communicate with anybody out the US unless there's a reciprocal agreement signed between the governments. So we had a discussion, and we said to the FCC, but guys, the 2-meter band is not from 144 to 146 or 148 in some areas. The satellite segment is only 200 kilohertz. Oh, they didn't think so. So the first few experimental licenses, they were telling the guys that you can go anywhere in the 2-meter band, that's fine. And that's when we came up, after lots of discussion, and say, well, maybe we must stop coordinating all non-amateur satellites. But there's a big danger in that, because as the FCC's understanding was that it's a huge band, so was a lot of other people. And what would happen is we would get all these signals coming into all our terrestrial communication systems as well. And it could just play havoc with repeaters and whatever. So we have one allocation, of course, 144 to 145, we know is worldwide. The other areas have a bit more. And it's actually 145 point, 999, so 146. And the satellite allocation in there is 145, 800 to 146. And the other interesting thing is we get requests, and they're asking us for 145, 995. Now, clearly, with Doppler, that's going to be out the band. But they keep on saying, well, why can't we use that? Right, there's also the new link, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that a bit later on, which hasn't quite been sort of finalized. Some interesting developments there. That's going to happen at the IARU Region 1 conference that's taking place. Where? Somewhere in the east, Eastern Europe. That's right. Nice place. Right. The most used of all VHF bands accommodates, in UTAC 2-meter band is the most used. It accommodates weak terrestrial signals, moon-bound packet radio systems, including APRS, propagation beacons, repeater systems, satellite communication. You'll find it's a very useful band, and it's used very widely. Now I'm stuck here. Yep. Some administration, notably the US, as I explained to you, decided the licensing of university and commercial research missions in the amateur satellite service does not comport with the definition of the amateur service in terms of the ITU. So instead of doing, instead of licensing, it's provided the experimental stations according to ART 27, despite they're having no status with regard to causing or harmful interference. And that's another thing. If a non-amateur satellite operates on amateur frequencies, they now sign a declaration with us to say, if they cause interference, we can demand them to switch off immediately. In other words, we're trying to protect the amateur service in that way. Whether or not that's going to happen, I don't know. We fortunately have not had that kind of necessity to do that. But it may well happen as we get more and more. Right, so the IARU to the rescue. When the US administration changed their licensing policy, and many CubeSats originally coordinated as amateur satellite stations were already built and manifested for launch, we decided we will actually sort out their frequencies. Even if they use 2-meter uplinks or 2-meter downlinks, we will assist them in doing that, seeing a lot of these. They were quite in a problem, because when that regulation changed in the US, and it only applies to the US, the launch agency said, but hang on, unless you have a letter from the IARU that you are frequency coordinated, we will not manifest you on our launch. So there was a big scramble for one of the Ilana launches that was taking place within about 2 months after that decision was taken. They would have been denied their launch at all. And after consulting widely, a set of terms and conditions to accommodate experimental stations on a temporary basis was devised. And look at the word temporary, because we believe that ultimately the world needs to go back to the drawing board and look for frequency spectrum or spectrum for those experimental university commercial experimental satellites. They cannot live in the amateur band forever, because there are too many of them already. And it's just creating a bit of chaos. Right, so we held the view all the time that non-amateur satellites, that are satellites missions inconsistent with radio regulations 1.5 and 1.57 should not be coordinated in the amateur service, in amateur service frequency bands. Therefore, the IARU recommends that these CubeSat builders look at bands allocated to existing services appropriate for their mission rather than the 2-meter band. Now, there are other frequency bands within the ITU band plan that could be used for certain of these scientific missions. But hey, it's so easy. Just tell them to use the amateur bands. You don't have any more paperwork. It's plain sailing, and the administrations don't have to wreck their brains of how to facilitate this. So beginning of this month, we are no longer able to accept frequency coordination requests for experimental stations in the 2-meter band. However, we will continue to coordinate frequencies in the 2-meter band for satellites that carry true amateur radio payloads. Now, that also means is that, like some of those applications that we've made much earlier, like the QB50 set of CubeSats, we will still coordinate where we cannot convince them that they shouldn't be using the 2-meter uplink. As an interim solutions, we think, well, there's a 1260, 1270 megahertz band, but it's not actually being used. And why aren't we looking at using that particular unused spectrum, or hardly used spectrum, put it that way? As I said, it's not envisaged that coordination will set any precedents. We believe that we made it quite clear. And we're also actively participating, or the IARU is, in discussions to find solutions to the problem. And there are some discussions going to take place at WRC 15, but it may not be until the following one, because there is no particular agenda item at the moment. So we still provide coordination at 2-meter band to the best of our ability for experimental CubeSats that are already designed and built. So therefore, you know, we don't expect people to scrap that, but we'll try and encourage them where possible to change. Some of them are frequency agile enough to swap around. Some not. And and that frequency coordination application form is fully completed and signed by the licensee or authorized representative for experimental license and payloads. Now, the terms and conditions are that the licensee agrees the following conditions, and you can see there's a whole lot of conditions. And basically the main condition is, and I'm not going to read for all of those, but the main condition is basically is that it may not cause interference to any other coordinated satellite and no amateur radio ground operation, or and so these conditions go on. It also says that it must be fitted with something that, and I'm very impressed with your with the $50 satellite, that you actually have heeded to the requirements in the ITU regulation, that it actually, you need to be able to switch it off. There's many of these experimental satellites that don't. The argument is, oh, well, the battery will run out. But that's not acceptable in terms of ITU. All right, there's enough control stations or stations around the world that be able to actually perform that particular function. And there's a whole lot of other kind of like conditions that allows me to decline and saying you're not meeting those requirements, and that frequencies in the amateur and amateur satellite services are shared. And you'd be surprised. I get some prof that write to me and says, but you've also allocated or coordinated the same frequency to another university in the US, and I'm in Japan, and I want my own personal frequency. Well, it's not possible, because the amateur service is a shared service. Can you just imagine? I mean, where can you provide a private frequency in the 2-meter band, or even today in the 70 centimeter band, and say you can have that exclusively? I mean, it's just, but they don't really understand what amateur radio is about, and that's the kind of things that they have to now sign for. It does not guarantee, as I said, that the same frequency will not be licensed, and also that the licensee agrees to notify the IARU whenever the experimental station license expires, when they have a launch failure, mission termination, and launch date and coordination request passes without the launch occurring. Now, we have a big problem with that, because, you know, once we've issued a coordination letter, many times, that's the last time we ever hear We don't know where it was successfully launched unless you check Mike's website. Normally you can find it there. But I mean, the onus is really on those people to advise us, to say, we've launched, it's successful, it's not successful, this is a problem, satellites in decay, it's not going to re-enter, or it has re-entered. We're often in the dark, well, mainly time in the dark, unless, and Mike is very good at picking those up, far better than any of us are. Maybe we're all too busy trying to do the paperwork instead of spending time on listening. But thanks for that, Mike. Now, come on. And so we continue with a lot of these conditions. And I mean, to us as radio amateurs, a lot of these are just common sense. We've gone through all that. We've gone through that. And we have appeal. Those guys that are producing these satellite kits, guys, please look at other amateur band frequencies until such time as the ITU has managed to organize and arrange different frequencies. You know, the ITU process is extremely slow. So we understand you cannot tell every university or research institution, listen, hang on, you cannot launch a satellite because we will not allow you to use amateur frequencies. Now, in the US it's controlled. In other countries it's not. I mean, many of the authorities just don't understand what amateur radio is about. They find it's an easy way. And in some countries, people go ahead and don't even advise their local administration. They actually are using amateur frequencies. They normally use an amateur license, and you find out that the person that they quote as the licensee actually was just notified, and he's actually not involved in the project. So our appeal is to those guys that produce these commercial kits. Look at other frequencies. Just don't stick to only 2 meters and 70 centimeters because we're going to run out of space there. There are many other frequencies still available that you could use until such time as the frequencies are being coordinated by the ITU in other bands. And there are other bands available. There's a continued changing around. You know, I mean, at one stage, everybody wanted HF, and then everybody wanted VHF, and the commercial world wanted UHF. Now they don't even want it anymore. Now they're looking at the centimeter bands. So that's a problem, of course, that amateur radio frequencies are always under challenge, because there's always somebody that wants to take the slice that we have. And yeah, that's another, of course, issue is that unless we are using the frequencies that are allocated to us, we have a far bigger chance of actually finding commercial interest, making enough noise to actually get those frequencies. And we see this now in many countries on the 70 centimeter band where, you know, the bands in some countries become smaller and smaller and kind of things like that happen. So that's really our appeal to the... and also we encourage customers to work with AMSAT groups and national amateur radio societies. In other words, if a university wants to build to do a scientific project on a CubeSat, trying to involve the local amateur radio amateurs or the local society in that. Because A, you may get expertise that you haven't got. So team up with your scientists that want to do their payload of growing seeds or growing flowers on a satellite and send down some telemetry. Team up with the local amateur radio group. Team up with an AMSAT, or an AMSAT group in your country, AMSAT UK, AMSAT NA. I mean, there's lots of AMSAT groups in the world now. Team up with them and get them to support you or bring some expertise on board that have understanding of RF, of operations like that. And that's really, you know, what we believe, that even when a supplier supplies, and I know they're in the business of supplying equipment, but encourage these people that you supplied it to, hey, contact your local amateur radio group. They can be a lot of use to you, a lot of assistance to you. And I think that's really basic, the story on that. So, yeah, thank you. To say IARU is working with national societies in the interest of amateur radio, and national societies need to start playing their part also by engaging their regulatory authorities, by helping them understand where we are going as radio amateurs. And in some countries, I think there's a pretty good relationship between Ofcom and RSGB and AMSAT UK. I think you guys are interacting here. And you find in the FCC and ARL are are interacting a lot. But in many countries, there is absolutely no contact between the National Society, AMSAT group, and their regulator. And that's where our biggest danger lies in the future. We have too many CubeSats and too few frequencies. Thank you.
Thanks, Hans. It's going to be a tough nut to crush, but it's not a new one. We're going to go in a minute into a general discussion mode about IARU satellite coordination. But do you have any specific questions on what Hans has said so far?
It must be on the...
Yeah, I'll go and get that one. None for the floor. We'll go to the internet, excuse me.
While Jim is going there, our next discussion is just an open discussion on that. And I'd just like to just say thank you to the team that supports me. And some of them are here. Mike is here today. Thank you very much, Mike. And Graham is here today. And the other guys, maybe they're watching. We have two people in the US, Art Fella, and we also have, and I don't have the slide with those names on, and we also have Lee, who supports us, and then we have Suzuo in Japan, that actually part of the team. So we actually meet on a regular basis, and that's quite a challenge because of the time differences, and we all have to work. Most of us have to work. So, you know, it was very good in the old days when we only had European-based participation in the US because we could do it at night because the time zones are about the same. But now we have a problem that we have to do it midday to accommodate both US and to accommodate Japan at a reasonable time. So the US complains because it's at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. Japan it's 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, and for us in the UK, in Germany, it is like in the middle of the day, so it's lunchtime or whatever. And of course, one of the guys I didn't mention was Graham, and he plays a very important part.
I'm here now, so
Okay.
There are three questions. The last one first, if I may. Have you got any examples of what you might describe as the good practice that you'd like to see introduced? Recent examples?
I think there are good practices in some of the organizations that do that. I mean, we've learned about a good practice today from the $50 satellite, which understands that you need to be able to control the satellite and be able to switch it off should something go wrong. And we have those good practices. We also have a good practice in some organizations say, well, we only have an interest for 6 weeks or 8 or 2 months or 3 months, but we will include a way in making it more attractive or include a transponder, and we've seen a couple of those. I think that maybe the other good practice is that some of these institutions are starting to understand better. They realize they're actually squatting, if you like, on amateur frequencies. They shouldn't be there. So they become more accommodating, and they will accept that we say, well, you can't be on this frequency, but hey, this frequency would be better suited. So, yeah, we do get that cooperation
Just
from some.
One more question, and this is from VU3TYG. He's saying we are seeing commercial startups using amateur frequencies for uplinks and telemetry. Do you think approving such requests will risk us losing frequencies? And just to finish off, several people would like to thank you for your presentation.
Well, thank to all the people that have been watching. Maybe they can see the picture better than I can. I still have this black screen in front of me. I hope somebody's going to fix it so I can use my laptop tonight. It is a danger, and that's why we make it quite clear in every non-amateur application on our letter saying, yes, we have coordinated the frequency, though. We also tell them what we expect them to do, and we say, well, in terms of the ITU regulations, number one, you know, the different ones, you are not strictly speaking in terms of the ITU permitted to use amateur frequencies, so therefore you need to discuss this with your regulator. So what we're doing is we're sending those people back to their own regulators. Whether they ever do, we don't know, because we're all a voluntary organization. So if you get like 30, 40 requests some months. You can't just follow up too much on that, unfortunately. But yeah, there is a danger, and that's why we're continually saying, well, we need to pursue with different regulators through IARU and national societies to say that some of these satellites need to find their own spaces in the frequency domain, and we need to assist in working. And there's some working groups at ITU that have been talking about these kind of things. And yeah, maybe in the next 10 years we will find that some people will get their own spectrum and that the amateur bands remain amateur. Yeah, in some countries, the regulators take action. I remember the time that, what was it, the watch people, they wanted to launch some stuff, and that actually, one of the governments involved in that, she stopped it and said, no, that's not going to happen on amateur frequencies.
Okay. And thanks very much for that, for entertaining and informative talk. I'd like everyone to show their appreciation for it. Thank you very much. We'll now go on for this